and I have to choose 3, which is not fair. But in discussions I picked up 3 topics. I think the first is the main topic, is like there's no trading taking place on Korean allowances, mainly because there's no supply and demand curve. There's no price reporting agency available. There are very limited intermediaries allowed. There are only a few banks who are allowed to participate in the market. And then, of course, there's also a role for brokers. I think all those topics, I bundled them together, is how do you encourage trading? I think that's I think the main topic, and the solution to that is very simple. It's basically allowing price agencies to report on prices, creating supply and demand curves, and of course, stimulate more active participations of brokers in the market. That topic also relates a little bit to the second I want to bring up, which is the 10,000 Korean won, which goes up, I think if I'm correctly, in 2017 to 30,000 Korean won. It's like a price price expectation of the government. That makes people hesitant to trade. One question on that was asked, will history repeat itself, like we've seen in the EU ETS, but I believe also in other emission trading schemes? Market goes up, and we see in March, June, the first verification taking place, and actually we might not be that short here as well, what could potentially be the case. And then I think naturally you see trading picking up, whether or not compliance will provide a position in the market, and then a lot of information will become available, and then more trading will be picked up also by the exchanges. The third point, and this one I chose on purpose, one question was asked that the Korean government is open to link in 2021 to potentially other markets. And the question was raised, is that good for the Korean economy? And I strongly believe that is a good thing for the Korean economy, because the Korean economy is quite an efficient economy. Those limited Korean offset projects which are available can lower your compliance cost. But if you have access to cheaper offsets outside Korea, it will actually lower your overall cost. So it's beneficial for Korea. It's also beneficial for the planet, because the more global it will, the less your global abatement curve will be. So in that sense, we really would encourage that linking in 2021 to take place, whether or not it is with China or with another Asian country or potentially Australia. I don't see Paul here now, but or the EU, I think in general, but I think the Korean market first needs to develop itself. And I think at near compliance seasons, when we know things, I think things will really kick off in Korea. So I think in general, the rules are set, the market is hesitant, but it will come. And there are still some issues to be covered in the power sector. We talked also about combined heat gas, whether or not that should have the same treatment in Europe. So we went into quite some detailed discussions. So I think it was very good, and I would like to thank the group for its active contribution in that. And if there are more questions, you have my business card, so very much appreciated. Thanks.
Well, so our group also mainly from the power sector, one from K-Water and one from the Korea nuclear and, how do you call that again? Nuclear and hydro power. So there were 2 main topics that we discussed. Of course, we discussed many different things within the time that we spent discussing, but 2 main topics. One was on the renewable credits, how it's being treated, and there seems to be some debate within the ministry and people who've invested in renewable offset projects in the past. And I guess right now they're still struggling to find the right precedent, whether it's the EU or any parts of the world, how this has been treated. And very difficult to find the exact, one-to-one comparison that matches the situation in Korea. And I don't think the group we had was able to give all the answers. So I don't know, you're a major renewable producer in Europe. Maybe you can be able to share your experiences with the group that we had there as well. But clearly, the legislation itself is a bit ambiguous. It talks about, we're talking about offsets, but the legislation talks about RECs. So it's sometimes very difficult to understand what exactly the legislation meant, but also it's right now there's a lot of discussion about how to deal with the double counting issue. It's sensitive to say it's double counting because on one side you're talking about offset credits, and on one side you're talking about the renewable energy credits, which is two different things. The government is concerned that you're benefiting from two different things from one project, and that has to be dealt in a sensible way right now. But more importantly, right now, all the industry and the government are also discussing to find the precedent. So I think that's something that we should continue to help find. Another thing, major concern from the power sector is the availability of the credit itself, because maybe you're talking about some industries who have, targets that can be achievable from internal abatement. And I think that's what the Ministry of Environment is encouraging people to do. Instead of going out and look for offsets, why not focus more on your internal abatement? Now, the power sector consistently is saying that there's really no means of reducing the emission level unless they produce less electricity right now. Fuel switch is way too expensive. It takes time to implement these projects as well. So where to get the availability of the credits is a major issue. And we talked a lot about how to create the liquidity in the market, how to create more flexibility, because today there's not a lot of options available for them. And on top of the options, limited options, it's not a liquid market. So it has to be resolved one way or another, or else they'll end up coming to a situation where many people are just without any credits to submit, and they'll end up paying a penalty, even if they're willing to pay a price for this right now. So those are the two major topics that we discussed. And I guess there's no answer. I think we all have to continue to discuss, make sure the government hears it, and then we try to come up with a solution to solve all this through the market mechanism. Okay, thank you.
Apologies for the confusion. I wasn't sure we had any textiles in our. We didn't discuss that. So we started by talking about how to optimize offset project development and carbon management, but we actually evolved that discussion a lot. Initially was that we were talking about we are very efficient already, there's no further opportunities for improvement, this is kind of a nightmare. Nobody mentioned that word, but they felt that this is not a good development. But I have to say, I think we left it on a high. And I'm just going to give you some sort of key lessons learned over the last sort of 2 hours. First of all, there are some solutions, we think, possibly around technology partnerships, partnering with the unlikely, maybe also working with your supply chain to look at reducing emissions, basically cooperating to overcome policy obstacles. So maybe rather than spend your energy in fighting the regulation, maybe spend that time and money working with your nearest and dearest and maybe new partners to look at new solutions. Korean industry has done this before, so there's probably no, it shouldn't be a difficult thing. We also discussed innovation funds, open source, open technology, and to invite solution providers through incentives. And the method for this, we were discussing some thoughts around leadership required from the top and really making climate risk relevant to top management. because then you get the right incentives internally. So rather than fighting this as a regulatory issue, actually seeing it as a business opportunity. But for this to work well, for industry to have the right incentives, communication is key. And we obviously heard that the government will open up for further consultation. So the importance of engaging in that communication is absolutely key to achieve a common objectives. And a couple of considerations. Really, offsets might not be the right strategy. You have to assess your options from a risk, cost, and opportunity perspective. You have to do that analysis. You can't just go and look at offsets on its own. You need to see what's actually fit for purpose for your company. And also see the emission targets as an opportunity, not as a cost. That's all.
Hello, I'm Young from ICES. We were not actually like the group of metal and non-ferrous industries, but it was rather a mixture of academia, the one from academia and like one from financial institution and two from the relevant industry and one from the consulting sector. So we've got like a variety of feedback, but still, so our discussion pivoted around three main issues. The first, low trading volume. Second, the implication of $10,000 as an indicative price in Korean ETS. And lastly, like what is actually the role of financial institution? So for the trading volume, even though currently the trading volume is very low, but still we thought, but we discussed, well, the trading volume might be low because there is less incentives for those power and energy industry to come into the market to actually realize the demand into price. So basically, under the current market, the power trading operation guideline, the emissions cost is not actually included in the variable cost of generation. So for that reason, companies do not, even though the nature of emissions cost is an incremental cost of generation, those companies do not get compensated for their emissions. So the incentive is very low for power and energy industry to come into the market and buy allowances. If they are really short, and if they get really compensated by the market, they would come into the market and buy the price, even if the price is high, because they get compensated. So that was one of the issues we discussed. And the second price, what is actually the definition of 10,000 won as an indicative price? So we said, well, the government has said 10,000 won is the standard price, but it's just it's just a trigger price for the market stabilization measure. So it doesn't really mean that 10,000 Korean won is the right price or optimal price for the allowances for trading, but it's just a threshold. It's just a trigger price. If it is met, then market stabilization measure would be activated. So it's just like the trigger price, not actually the optimal price to be for those allowances to be traded at. Lastly, the role of financial institutions. So we all agree that it's quite vague what is the role of financial institution in Korean ETS. For instance, for the project financing, for those major development banks in European Union or other countries, they do have enough capacity to do the project financing. For example, they do have experts, not all of them, but some of them do have experts who knows about the process, who knows the process a lot. But when it comes to Korean financial institutions, they do lack the capacity to do that. So that's what I heard from the market entities today. So basically, those three issues, that's the common issues we discussed today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So in our group, we had mostly electronics manufacturers plus cement industries. So the three issues that we ended up focusing on were really around allocation and benchmarking, reduction strategies and offsetting, and sort of, I guess, a more of an internal issue, roles and responsibilities. How do you allocate, and who are the right people internally to take forward carbon strategies? So just briefly, a couple of points on each of those. On allocation and benchmarking, there was a lot of discussion. I guess the common sentiment was that there wasn't enough allocation. I guess and a concern that the reserve that the government has, which companies can then access after the first year of liability, won't be enough. And I guess that sort of stems from a concern about the longevity of the scheme in terms of, is this going to perhaps be changed? Is there a possibility that some of these design issues might be dealt with in the short term, or whether this is what companies have been dealt as far as the first phase and having to now sort of get ready to deal with that. So a lot of the solutions we talked about really looked perhaps more at scheme design, how you might deal with some of these concerns around under-allocation. So there was the example in California where there's a period of 3 years, you only surrender the full amount after 3 years with a smaller percentage in those first 2 years. Perhaps the government having a large reserve and maybe bring in auctioning around that. But in terms of the sort of non-scheme design solutions, we really talked about that in the context of risk mitigation. How do you, as a company, then manage that exposure, given that there's, I guess, a sense of not enough permits and not much trading happening at the moment. So we talked about, I guess, and that sort of became a discussion around sort of reduction strategies and offsetting. And what came clear out of that was a sense that in reality boards, CFOs, perhaps aren't really looking at this in terms of monetary terms yet. I mean, in terms of what the actual exposure is going to be in absolute monetary terms, in terms of paying for the penalty if there aren't enough permits or indeed offsets. But a recognition that that's going to be quite a big cultural change, because a lot of the teams that typically look at these things at the moment are your environment, OH&S and safety parts of the business. We reflected on the fact that that's not dissimilar to what happened in every other jurisdiction. So this was really the case in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and perhaps even now in California and elsewhere, that you tend to see starting off in those parts of the business, but as people realise more and more, the absolute cost exposure here tends to go up in importance, particularly into boards, which is a good thing. So we sort of talked about perhaps a key way to pushing liquidity in the short term, putting aside any scheme design issues, is to find ways to get these issues in front of CFOs, so that they're in a position of wanting to make a decision now about reduction strategies, offsetting, and actually sort of committing to the short-term targets over phase one, and then looking at it longer term. And we did have a little bit of discussion around litigation, not so much as a strategy, I should say, but more as what's happening in other markets and the prospect of litigation around some of these issues succeeding, which I guess as the lawyer on the table, I took a view that was going to be difficult to deal with, and that in many ways it's better to deal with those issues through policy dialogue rather than litigation. Thanks.